Good morning and welcome back to the League Winners Fantasy Show. I'm your host, as always, Dalton Salings, and today we will be diving into the NFC South. Before we get started, I do want to remind you that Monday we're going to have a little special surprise on the episode, so super excited for that. But without further ado, let me dive in with the Atlanta Falcons. I'm actually going to go to the quarterback situation last because there are some question marks there. I want to start with the running back, Bijan Robinson, really your other contender for the number one overall pick. On Monday, we talked about Jahmyr Gibbs with the Lions. Today, Bijan Robinson, I project him for almost 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns, and then 83 catches, 750 yards, almost 19 and a half fantasy points per game. Robinson and Gibbs are really your two contenders for the RB1 overall, the number one overall pick in your drafts. It's really going to be which guy do you believe in more. For me, it's Gibbs, but there's absolutely no shame in saying Robinson is the better player there at all. Brian Robinson is the second guy. So he's the new backup brought in from Washington. Excuse me, from Washington he came in. So Brian Robinson, I expect him to have a standalone value. Anytime you have a back as good in the passing game as you do with Bijan Robinson, can't just say Robinson because it's Bijan and Brian Robinson, but anytime you have a back as good as Bijan Robinson in the receiving game, they are going to need to come off the field for some of the rushing work just because you want them out there on third down. You want them fresh when you need them, stuff like that. So that is kind of where Brian Robinson is going to get his value. It's going to come on the ground. I have him for almost 600 yards rushing. I do think he can do a productive job on the ground this year, kind of filling in the gaps when Bijan is getting simply just a water break, basically. So he does offer some standalone value, and obviously, should Bijan go down, Brian Robinson steps into a much bigger role. In the receiving game, the number one option is Drake London. I have him for a big season, 1,150 yards, 90 catches, 6 scores, 11 and a half fantasy points per game. So he's being drafted as the wide receiver 8 right now, so he's going right behind A.J. Brown. I think that's a fair price for him. I think he has upside as well. If the touchdowns were to increase, that'd be a huge deal for him and help him to take the next step into the upper echelons of fantasy wide receivers. So he is an exciting person to keep an eye on. The two in this offense, it's starting to look like it's going to be the rookie Zachariah Branch. I have him a little bit lower right now, but I've already been moving him up in my rankings. I had him originally as the 4. I have him up to the 3 in projection on the Falcons. So he will likely, as camp progresses, end up as the 2. Right now, I have him just slightly behind Jahan Dotson. I expect him to overtake him through camp, but I am waiting for official reports to make that change because I don't want to jump the gun and be overdrafting a rookie in the offseason who hasn't or might not have the role that we think they're going to have when they were drafted. So Branch is a name to keep an eye on. I expect his role to be more clear as camp goes along, but until then, kind of holding off on moving him up, like I said, until we have official word. And then Kyle Pitts is there at tight end. I have him at just under 7 fantasy points a game. He ended the season very well. Fantasy playoffs had some huge games. I think that's making people very excited about drafting him. I'm not overly excited about drafting Pitts, so I have him, like I said, just under 7 fantasy points per game. I'm not overly high on him. He's going off the board as the tight end 8 right now, and I don't know that that's necessarily fair value. There are guys going behind him, well behind him, that I prefer over Pitts. So I'm drafting very little of Kyle Pitts right now. It's the running fantasy joke about Kyle Pitts, but I just don't see myself ending up with very much of Pitts just because it doesn't make too much sense for me to spend that draft capital for a guy where I don't really see the path to the upside. And part of the thing blocking the path to the upside is a quarterback play. You have Michael Penix and Tua. It's looking more and more like Tua will start the season as the 1. I don't know who will finish the season as the 1, and I don't even know for sure that it'll be Tua to start. I'm not really going to project anything for either of those quarterbacks. I don't think either are fantasy relevant, regardless of who wins the starting role. Like I said, I expect it to be Tua, but it doesn't make too big of a difference, in my opinion, who's the starter. I think Drake London. I was reading a very solid report the other day that was talking about the difference between Tua and Michael Penix when it comes to how it'll affect Drake London and the way they throw the football. So, from what I've heard and read, it'll be better for Drake London if Penix is starting, but I do believe he'll still be able to get production with Tua as well. So that's just something to keep an eye on. Like, it shouldn't matter too much who's starting. Neither of them should be drafted by you, but just something to keep an eye on, a little camp battle at quarterback. Moving on to the Carolina Panthers, Bryce Young came on really well at the end of the year. I have him about 13 fantasy points per game this year. He looked more like a former number 1 overall pick towards the end of the year last year. So we'll see if he can continue to grow off of that. He does have some returning weapons, pretty much the same. Receiving core is back. The running game is really where we might see the biggest change. So Chuba Hubbard is back. Rico Dowdle is out the door. And they're expecting Jonathan Brooks, who has been injured for the entirety of his 2 seasons, it feels like, to finally be healthy and be able to step up as the number two and potentially number one running back. I have him actually projected to outperform Chuba Hubbard. I believe that is a end of season push from Jonathan Brooks, not a early season production or anything. I think Hubbard opens the season as the one, but is supplanted as the year goes along by Jonathan Brooks. Now, last year, I said that same thing about Ramondre Stevenson and Travion Henderson. I was wrong-ish. They kind of had a 50-50 split all year. That could happen here. Brooks could get injured again. There's plenty of things that could happen, but I do expect if they're both healthy, Brooks will supplant Hubbard by the end of the year. So that's something to keep an eye on. I have them very close together. I have literally less than zero point 0.2 fantasy points per game separating the two players. So I'm all for drafting Chuba Hubbard, but I'm also all for drafting Jonathan Brooks. I think both of them should be rostered in fantasy this year and could be potential league winners if one or the other is to go down with an injury, which isn't ridiculous to say with Jonathan Brooks. Bryce Young's returning weapons in the receiving game. You have Tedero McMillan, who's back for another year. I have him eclipsing 1,000 yards, having 6 touchdowns and 10.5 fantasy points. He's going in the Garrett Wilson range. I think it's a fair spot for him. Like I said, I prefer Garrett Wilson, but I don't mind drafting Tedero McMillan at all. Should he be the one to slide or anything like that? Another young guy with some upside as well. So he has plenty of upside as a second-year player now. So I do like McMillan. Jalen Coker is back as well. I have him for about 5.5 fantasy points per game. Nothing special. If Young takes another step forward, Coker and McMillan both kind of take a step because there's more targets, there's more receptions, there's more yards, there's more touchdowns to go around for everybody. If he performs just to my expectations, Bryce Young, that is, I don't expect huge seasons from McMillan or Coker, but like I said, if you're a believer in Bryce Young, there's no reason not to take a little gamble on McMillan or Coker. And then the tight end situation, I mean, it's Tommy Trimble, it's Jatavion Sanders. You're not drafting either of those guys. I'm not going to dwell on them too long here at all. We're going to move quickly through the Panthers into the Saints. The biggest Saints news right now is a restructuring of Alvin Kamara's contract, which does show that they will be keeping him on the roster. There was early conversation of will he get cut? Will he be a trade candidate? The restructuring of the contract makes it seem like he's going to be on the roster week one. They also brought in Travis Etienne, formerly Travis Etienne. So that was the big free agency signing for the Saints, which does mean that Kamara can take a backseat role, which is going to be nice. Etienne is going pretty healthily in drafts. He's going right around Javonte Williams, actually. He's slid a little bit with this Alvin Kamara news that's been coming out, but I have him for just over 10 fantasy points a game. The issue is Etienne's value, a lot of it comes through the passing game, and that's not going to be there nearly as much because Kamara is still there. He is obviously the ultimate receiving back. If you think back to his prime, thinking back longer than you'd like to, but Kamara was the ultimate receiving back, and so it'll be interesting to see how much receiving work Etienne can actually get with Kamara there. Kendre Miller's also in this backfield. I'm not worried about him taking work really at all. I think that ship has kind of sailed a little bit, but Etienne could see some work vultured by Alvin Kamara, which would be a little unfortunate, but I do still think he can have a positive fantasy impact. And if he slides because of positive Kamara news, I will be more than happy to kind of scoop up the leftover shares of that every single time. In the receiving game, you got Chris Olave. They also drafted Jordan Tyson, and I have Devon Vele statted as well as kind of the third receiver there. So Chris Olave, I have about 10.7 points per game, so I have him above McMillan. He's going above McMillan. He's going in the Zay Flowers range, which is interesting. I do think I prefer Zay Flowers over Olave just because Olave has been banged up so much. But that's why a lot of people are liking Jordan Tyson, the rookie out of Arizona State. I have him projected for just 7.5 fantasy points per game, which isn't anything special, but should Olave get banged up, he steps into the one role, and that's a very productive offense. I've been drafting in some best ball drafts Devon Vele as my last pick, just as the third receiving option in that offense. Once again, should Olave go down, he slides up to the two. I'll take a wide receiver two on a team for free with my last pick. So that's kind of my thought process there. In redraft, I wouldn't be looking Vele's way, but Tyson and Olave both would be getting drafted. Juwan Johnson's been getting a lot of buzz as well. I have about 6.5 fantasy points per game, so close to Kyle Pitts, but he goes much later. A lot of people like him. A lot of people are in on Tyler Shuck this year at quarterback to take the step forward. I'll talk about him in just a second, but I do think that's where a lot of the hype around Juwan Johnson is coming from. It's from that kind of Tyler Shuck taking the next step as a quarterback. I have Shuck for almost 3,900 yards, so a very productive season for him. But just 18 touchdowns. I don't know that the touchdowns come. If they do come, I think Shuck is incredibly productive at quarterback. I'm 13.5 fantasy points per game, more than Bryce Young, stuff like that. So I think he could have a productive season, but man, I feel like the touchdowns have to come, and I don't know that they will. That's my biggest fear with Shuck and really the whole Saints offense. If there are more touchdowns, Olave goes up a tier, Tyson goes up a tier, Johnson goes up a tier. But if there's not those touchdowns there, those guys are going to struggle a little bit just trying to make it off of yards and catches. So I do hope that Tyler Shuck can take the step forward touchdown wise, but I'm not projecting it, and that is what gives me a little bit of pause. I've drafted Tyler Shuck still because I think the upside's there, but it does worry me a little bit on if touchdowns will be coming for Tyler Shuck. And then our final team, we're flying through today, which is a perfectly fine thing because I do think Monday is going to be a bit of a longer episode, so just preparing for that. But the Buccaneers, Baker Mayfield, I have him at almost 15 fantasy points a game. It's always weird statting out Mayfield because you feel like he has more rushing upside, but when you look at the numbers, he really doesn't. He throws his body on the line. He's a tough player, but he doesn't really have that rushing upside you want from a fantasy quarterback. But I have him throwing for 40,000 yards, and he's 4,000 yards, excuse me, and he's proven he can sling the rock for touchdowns. I have him for 27 touchdowns. So that's a good fantasy season, nearly 15 points per game. He goes cheap in drafts because a lot of people have the similar, wait, I thought he had more upside, than they look into it and realize he didn't. So I think he's probably fairly priced right now. I don't have too many shares of him, but he is accurately priced at the moment. Bucky Irving is in the backfield. There's also Kenneth Gainwell and there's Sean Tucker. So I'm going to sit in this backfield for a second here because Bucky Irving's coming off injury. Kenneth Gainwell had a very strong close to the year in Pittsburgh last year. He was a favorite target of Aaron Rodgers. And then Sean Tucker is just back for another year. So Rashad White's gone. With Rashad White leaving, there's this conversation of, oh, Bucky Irving is a smash pick, right? Because his biggest competition is gone. Then it's like, oh, his health's a question mark, and they brought in Kenneth Gainwell, who's going to take passing work. I absolutely have that projected. I have him for 50 targets this year, which could be underselling it. I just don't think Baker Mayfield hit the running backs as much as Aaron Rodgers did. But Bucky Irving's health scares me, and it's why I'm not drafting much of him right now. His projection of 10 fantasy points a game is fine for where he's going. He's going in the Quinshon Judkins, Bashal Tutin, DeAndre Swift range. So he's going right in with those guys right now. I don't mind that draft price for him, but it's the injury risk that really scares me. I've had conversations with a friend of the program, Nathan Meehead, who's been on before, who is discussing just his worries of the injury with Irving and what the upside really is when he comes back without the passing game work as much. So I just need to keep an eye on Kenneth Gainwell is being a little overdrafted right now, just because people think Irving could miss time and Gainwell should step in as the true one if that were to happen. So that is something to keep an eye on, is making sure you don't overdraft Kenneth Gainwell just if you're out on Bucky Irving. I've been pretty much out on the entire Bucks rushing offense. I've drafted a few shares of Sean Tucker late. I do have a little bit of Kenneth Walker, but as a whole, I'm not drafting very much of the Buccaneers offense in the slightest right now. I'm sorry, rushing attack, because even actually, to be fair, I'm not drafting too much of the top receiver either. Emeka Ibuka is now the number one guy because Mike Evans is in San Francisco. So Emeka Ibuka, I have projected for about just over 8.5 fantasy points per game, almost 800 yards and 7 touchdowns receiving. So I'm not drafting too much of him. He's going very highly in drafts. He's an expensive draft pick. I don't know that I've drafted any of Emeka Ibuka. Chris Godwin goes a lot cheaper. Obviously, there's always the injury risk with Godwin, but I have him for 7.5 fantasy points per game if he's healthy. I prefer that at a discounted draft price rather than Ibuka, because I think there's a world where Godwin is the one. I think there's a path to him being the wide receiver one on this team. He's more experienced and has the chemistry with Mayfield. Obviously, Ibuka did show it last year, but Godwin has the long-term chemistry with Mayfield, and so it wouldn't shock me if Godwin ends up as the highest fantasy producer on this team at a much cheaper draft cost. And then there's a conversation of, okay, Jalen McMillan, Ted Hurst, and Tez Johnson. So I think McMillan's the third receiver on the field. I like him at about 5 fantasy points per game. Once again, a late round guy I have drafted some of just because you don't know the health of Godwin. Honestly, you don't know the health of Ibuka either. Anything can happen. So he's a third receiver that I do think the Bucks will run 3 receiver sets. He can get the ball still. I am for 40 catches. I'm getting him in some best ball drafts. Redraft probably won't be drafted, and that's perfectly fine. The tight end is going to be Kate Otten. I have him at about just over 5 fantasy points per game. Otten led tight ends last year in routes run, which is remarkable to me. He's going to be on the field. A lot of times when I'm doing best ball drafts of other sports, I'll look at, okay, are they on the field? Are they on the court? Whatever it is, because you can't coach that. If you're on there, something good could happen, and that's kind of the pitch with Kate Otten is he's going to be on the field, and so something good could happen while he's out there. So I think he'll have some boom weeks, but I think he'll have some potential goose eggs of straight up no production. Second tight end, I think that's a fine thing to have. You're going to hopefully just play him on a bye week and hope that's a week he hits. I don't mind that in the slightest, but you're not really looking at K. Dotton as he's a sleeper, top 12 tight end. I don't believe he has that upside at all. I think he is purely he'll have the weeks where he scores touchdowns, he's good, and that's about it. I have him for just 2 touchdowns. I think he could score 3 or 4. I think there's probably 4 weeks where you can play K. Dotton this year. and that's it. So you're obviously not going to be drafting that as a tight end one in the slightest. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode a little bit quicker today. The written format, the NFC North episode will be in the description as well. That's got a little bit shorter as well. I know it was a long read for anyone that was reading it. It was a lot of words that were getting typed up. Sometimes I get ahead of myself like I do with talking and just end up writing an essay on somebody. So make sure I cut that down a little bit for anybody checking in on the written portion. But I want to thank you for tuning in today, and I encourage you to check back on Monday where we'll have a very special surprise. Thank you.